add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
Often companies make the mistake of not focusing on diversity until they're at a certain size and a certain level of visibility, and then they look around and go, oh gosh, everyone on our executive team is a guy.
Hi, everyone. It's Britt Ryan from Intello, back for another scintillating episode of Hiring on All Cylinders. I am really excited to have one of my newer but quickly valued partners here from one of our investors, Battery Ventures. So we're going to be talking today with Kelly Kinnard, who's the VP of Talent at Battery Ventures. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Britt. Thanks so much for having me.
We are so happy to have you here today. You know, it's been so interesting for me working with you, and we've talked to other people over time who have your role as a VP of talent or some sort of a recruiting related role with on the venture capital side. But I'd be so curious in understanding, since you're the first person who came to Battery, tell me a little bit about that. What was the journey for Battery in terms of realizing that they could benefit from having someone like you, and what that means for companies like Intello who are part of the portfolio?
Sure, absolutely. So Battery is both a venture capital and private equity firm, and we have about 125 active portfolio companies. And we're unique in the sense that we invest anything from seed stage on the venture side all the way through buyout on the private equity side. And we have companies all over the world. And Intello's obviously on our venture growth side and one of our very important portfolio companies. But my role is really just to help the portfolio companies with anything recruiting related. So I tend to partner with people like you and work with our portfolio company CEOs and be just a resource and someone that they can go to for ideas, help, resources, anything that comes up that may be recruiting related that they are needing as they're scaling and they're growing.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. So with our relationship, when we became introduced to you, we were looking at adding an executive or direct report to our CEO, John. So with some of your earlier stage companies, are you actually helping them think through sort of basics, block and tackle? You're using recruiting on spreadsheets, getting to an ATS. Like, what does that look like? What's the difference between maybe a Series A company that's early stage and somebody that's a little bit further along like Intello?
Sure. So we have some companies that may just be 3 or 4 people working out of a garage, literally, or a very small office. And so sometimes at that level, they typically don't need executives, especially at the senior level. They're looking for primarily engineers or for sales reps. But engineers is something that I hear over and over from our very early stage companies. They need people that can come in and help build the product. So it's helping them think through things like, we need to build an engineering team and we need to hire, 5 or 10 or 25 engineers over X amount of months. And how should we do that? And what does that look like? And what are some learnings that you've seen other companies do? What are some mistakes other companies have made that we could potentially learn from? And then also just helping them with resources in terms of, here are recruiters that I recommend that specialize in individual contributor level engineering hires. And then as they make more progress just in terms of growing and scaling, then I help them think through, okay, now you're ready to hire an executive. What does that look like and why? And how should you look at the role and how should the role be shaped? And let's talk about what makes the most sense from a recruiting perspective as you scale and grow, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And with the early stage companies, if you have 4 or 5 people in a garage and they say, we need to hire 5 engineers, are you usually then helping them to partner, as you said, with, is it like an agency model? Or I think it's always so interesting too, because we'll get into this, but you've also worked for companies like Oracle where you have this massive brand and how that impacts your candidate flow versus we're 4 guys in a garage. So what's the difference? How do you attract somebody for a role like that? And what's the real hook in in finding someone for a super early stage company?
Sure, it's hard, I think, for them because they know their company is amazing and they know they have fantastic technology, but depending on what their brand looks like and how, if they have a website, sometimes they don't even have a website at that point, or they're still in stealth mode. They're trying to compete in this very intense war for talent amongst other companies that are either startups that have a brand name, or they're larger companies like the Facebooks and the Googles of the world. And they typically still need and want that same level of talent, and they're not willing to compromise, nor should they. So I will often help them think that through and then refer them to contingency recruiters who I know and trust, who specialize at helping very early stage companies build out their recruiting teams. So there are a couple that I just have good relationships with that I feel confident can come in and help them in terms of, here's what the market looks like from a comp perspective, and these are the most in-demand skills, and be a thought partner to them as well. Whereas my background is more recruiting at the senior executive level, so I can help them with sort of strategy and tactics, but I don't often meet individual contributor engineers. So if I meet one and I can refer them to a portfolio company, great, but I'm usually not as helpful as I am whenever a company needs a senior executive.
Yeah. And I've always found it challenging. There are so many contingency options out there, and figuring out who's going to be the one that's good, especially as you're growing, that's going to represent and tell your story. What does your process look like to weed out the good from the bad?
Sure. I agree. I think there's a lot of noise, and as a former boss of mine used to say, anyone with a roll of quarters can start a recruiting company. I think it's an interesting industry because there isn't a barrier to entry like there is with law. You don't need a law degree or a medical license. So I think there are a lot of fantastic ones, but there are a lot of ones that just are not the right option. So I honestly just refer the ones that I know and that I trust and that I have relationships with that I know will work really hard to deliver. And I think I'm lucky in the sense that they're incentivized to do a good job because they know then I will then refer them to other portfolio companies. But there are a handful that are great, but it's all about the right person, the right team, and the right contingency agency at that level.
Yeah, that's such an important thing, too, when you think about if you do it well once, then the relationship and the follow-up business that can be earned from that is exponential. So
right.
It's always good to do a good job the first time and keep on building on that. So, okay. Well, I mentioned this, and I'd love to talk a little bit, like, how did you end up at Battery? Because you had this huge role at Oracle, which is such a monstrous company. And having worked in retained search throughout your career and having different opportunities, I'm kind of curious to understand a little bit about, like, how did you land at Oracle, and then what sort of prompted the move for you to move to Battery?
Sure. So I did retain search for two different Bay Area-based search firms, SP&B and Riviera Partners, and I loved it, and it was great. And when I first got the call about the role at Oracle, I said, oh, no, I'm not the right person for you. That's not what I want to do next, but I'll give you some referrals and, happy to help. But they were really persistent. And what was most appealing about the role was the opportunity to come in and work directly for the president of the company who runs all of technology, Thomas Kurian, and have a seat at his table. And if it was a role at Oracle that would have just been more not quite as senior within the organization in terms of how the role was structured, it wouldn't have been as appealing to me, to be honest with you. But the more I learned about it and the more I learned about what he wanted to do and how he thought about recruiting, the more interesting it became. And so when we met, we just had instant rapport and chemistry and just really connected. And I think he understands how hard recruiting is. And a lot of senior leaders that I've met, a lot of even CEOs sometimes don't understand and appreciate how difficult recruiting is and how much work is involved and value it the same way, but he really did. So I literally walked out of his office saying, I'm going to go work for Thomas Kurian if he'll have me. And it was a great experience. And I was there for 3.5, almost 4 years. But, Oracle's a big company. It's a huge company. And over that time, I personally recruited 50 senior executives myself without using any retained search firms to support all the efforts that Oracle is making in the cloud. But I knew all along that I would go to a venture capital or private equity firm next. And over the years, had interviewed and met with multiple venture and private equity firms, and it was just never quite the right team or the right role or the way they were thinking about it. I necessarily didn't quite agree with. And then when I got the call about Battery, I said to the recruiter that they hired to do the search, I said I would absolutely take that job if I got it. And then it was an 8-month interview process with Battery before I got the job. But yeah, it all worked out. I could not be happier.
Wow. 8 months.
Yes.
We'll have to come back to that. So it's been really interesting for me because I've worked at large global companies like you, and Entella was the smallest company that I had come to. And one of the things that when I've talked with certain customers of Entello's, because they're in the recruiting space and they're my peer group, I think the one thing that I've learned is that there's a lot of recruiting that's the same, right? It doesn't matter if you have 15 people or 15,000. And so I'm curious for you, what were the things that you noticed going in-house at Oracle where you were like, yep, like this is the same? And what were some of the big differences and things that were big learnings for you going into an environment like that?
Sure. It was really interesting because I was the first person hired to work for Thomas that had a retained search background. And all the people he had support him in recruiting prior either came out of contingency or they were in-house recruiters their whole career. So I joined and I just started doing retained searches, but within Oracle, and Oracle was my client per se, even though I was, obviously an employee. And so he and the team just loved that I brought that retained search mindset and methodology and network. And so it was very interesting because I was able to just do what I did, but do it in a different capacity. But it was fascinating because I got to see how I knew and was aware of so much more that was happening within the company than I could have ever been had I been an outside retained search provider, because I knew all kinds of confidential information that you just could never tell a retained search provider. So I got to have that insight and knowledge, which was helpful, and then build the relationships within Oracle with not only Thomas, but his direct reports, and just try to push things forward and get people hired and get searches closed and work with HR and work with all the various other parts of the organization. So it was fascinating, but it was most interesting to me that I was able to come in and still recruit at that senior executive level. I didn't do anything below the VP level, which is what I wanted because that's my whole background.
Right. And doing that retained model, so it's so, like you said, it is so different. And some companies have built this out or start to build it out. But for you coming into an environment where they hadn't had it, was there a big ramp in terms of educating people to the value that you were bringing by doing this?
Yes, absolutely. So one example comes to mind. My very first week, I sat down with an SVP GM who was running a $3 billion business unit, and he needed a senior executive. And so I told him that here's how I kick off a search, and I just did it the way I'd kick off a retained search, and extracting the information I needed. And he said, well, send me 50 resumes, and then I'll look at the 50 resumes that you send me, and I'll decide who I'm going to interview. And I said, no, you're not going to see even 50 candidates ever. So I'm going to introduce you to 5 that I've thoroughly screened, that I know, that I think are a fit, and we'll then decide if you need more. But that's not really the way that this works. And so that was intimidating to tell senior people who are at that level, this is the way it works. But once they saw the value and they saw that I would write these elaborate analysis on the candidates, and that I had done back channel references before they even came into interview, and that I knew them and I had a lot more context, then all of a sudden they were all sold. And so Thomas was sold from the very first day. It was more kind of his direct reports, understanding that it was just very different from anything they had ever experienced at Oracle. Because some people there have worked at Oracle for many years. So unless they had been at other companies where they had used and utilized retained search recruiters, they just weren't familiar with it.
Right. And so now that you are helping companies and counseling them around when is the right time to do a retained search, what are some of the things that you look for in portfolio companies that you work with if they come to you and say, hey, we're at a point where we think we need an executive? when would they engage you? Do you find they're always engaging you? Do they sometimes go out on their own? Like, tell me a little bit, I guess, about how your brand has evolved and how you've sort of, grown your network within the portfolio companies at Battery.
Sure. Well, I spent the first 4 or 5 months spending a lot of time on site at portfolio companies and traveling around the world even. We have an office in Tel Aviv, and so I went and met with all of our Israeli portfolio companies and met with 12 of our companies in New York, and just sitting down with them and getting to know them one by one and case by case, basically. And I tell all of them, I always want to know when you have a VP or a C-level search or even something at the director level open in case I can be helpful. Maybe it's referrals, maybe it's questions that you have, maybe it's helping you vet retained search firms if that's the way you want to go, or you need introductions. So that's kind of how I've just done it on a case-by-case basis. But I think if they are ready to hire, as long as they are committed and they're really going to dedicate the time, you and I both know, doing a search internally takes up a lot of time from the executive team. So you just have to make sure that they're ready and willing to do it at that moment.
Yep. Got it. Have you noticed any differences globally? Like, what is it like for companies in Tel Aviv? Is it as competitive to find talent out there as we find it here in the Bay Area? Or
it's very different. So it's very different culturally. And I think Israel is such a small country, and everyone goes into the army. So everyone has this incredible network, and a lot of people know each other. And so what I notice our Israeli portfolio companies tend to struggle with is not necessarily hiring within Israel, because everyone's network is so strong. It's once they come to the US and then they open their first office in Santa Clara and they need to build a sales team or an engineering team, and they don't have the network here, and they're competing against all the other startups, all the big name companies, the Facebooks, the Googles of the world, and they've just never had to experience this before. So there's apparently, there's 2 really good recruiters in Israel at the executive level that know everyone, and everyone knows those 2 recruiters, and they know the network. But here it's just something that they've never experienced before. So it is quite different.
Yeah, interesting. Is there any counsel that you've found really successful if you're helping a company prepare to, if they're opening up in sort of the South Bay, or making a move to open an office? I feel for us here in the Bay Area, we're always looking at when's the point when you think about offshoring, or whether you're, a C or a D company, do you open up an office in Europe? And so for them coming in the other direction, what are some of the criteria that makes it the right time to do it?
Sure. Usually when they're at that inflection point of really needing to go to market, there's a lot of engineers and a lot of tech companies in Israel. And so a lot of the Israeli portfolio companies tend to have their R&D efforts in Israel, but then they now are at a point where they need to go to market. And so they need to scale marketing and sales, and they need US-based leaders and US-based people. And that's kind of the struggle for them, is then coming here. And even if it's a handful of them, it's just such a huge, vast network here, and all of us, even when you feel like you spend all day every day networking, you just can't know everyone. And so I think they are overwhelmed at times, and they need as much help as they can possibly get, trying to tap into not only their networks in the US, but also just the Silicon Valley network, which is huge in and of itself, as we both know.
I want to switch gears here a little bit, because it comes up so often, and we see it. You've mentioned the Facebooks, the Googles of the world. I'll put Uber out there as a company that's grown so quickly, but we also hear so much about your employment brand and about diversity in the marketplace, and how, women and all sorts of underrepresented people have really sort of been coming up, and they've been more vocal, and we're hearing a lot more about the efforts that companies are putting forward to have more diverse environments. Do you find that there's a certain point in time when you see that becomes important to a company, or what does it look like for companies as they're growing, and have you seen a shift in their focus on diversity, over the course of time that you've been doing search?
Sure. I think there is more focus on it now than ever before, which I think is really good. And I think there needed to be the focus that there is. But I think often companies make the mistake of not focusing on diversity until they're at a certain size and a certain level of visibility. And then they look around and go, oh, gosh, everyone on our executive team is a guy. And all of our board members are men. And now we're getting this visibility and potential criticism or some criticism in the market. So what should we do about it? And so what I always tell companies is, if possible, start thinking about it when you're 4 people. And if you can hire killer engineers or killer sales reps that are female, you will then be able to recruit more senior and more credible women over time. So I think they just need to think about it as early as possible and make a conscious effort. I think you should always hire the right person and the most qualified candidate, but I'm glad that companies are focusing on diversity. But the sooner you start thinking about it, the better would be my advice. Don't wait until then you're telling recruiters like you and I, well, now we need to hire someone, and now go get me a woman.
Right. Yeah. Find the best candidate for the job. And if you're always thinking about a diverse candidate pool, then ultimately the end result will be to have some diversity in there, right?
Right.
So,
But sometimes some companies just don't.
Yeah. So, well, sort of last question for you here, but I'm super curious. What's keeping you up at night? What are the things that you're working on that are really tough for you these days?
Having over 100 companies that I'm trying to help on any given day, that is the biggest, for me, that's the biggest challenge. And companies all over the world that have different needs and are varying sizes and stages, and that is what keeps me up at night, is just trying to help as many companies as possible that are all super important to us and we all want to see thrive and succeed. But there's just a lot of hiring going on, which is great. It's great for us. It's great for technology. It's great for Silicon Valley. But it seems like they're all hiring today. So being spread just very thin is what keeps me up at night, to answer your question.
Well, listen, Kelly, thank you again so much for your time. Knowing how truly busy you are now, I know even more so than I did half an hour ago. So grateful for your time, having spent it with us for Hiring on All Cylinders, and looking forward to hopefully having you back in the future.
Thank you. I would love to come back anytime.
Great.